Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Sumo Logic webinar, Making the Shift from DevOps to Practical DevSecOps. Our presentation today is going to be recorded, and you are currently in a listen-only mode. However, I'd encourage you to type any content-related questions or any quick technical or logistical feedback you may have at any time by using the chat pane on the left-hand side of your screen. Before we officially kick off, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, George Gerchow. As Sumo Logic's VP of Security and Compliance, George brings 18 years of information technology and systems management expertise to the application of IT processes and disciplines. His expertise impacts the security, compliance, and operational status of complex, heterogeneous, virtual, and cloud computing environments. George's practical experience and insight from managing the infrastructures of some of the world's largest corporate and government institutions make him a highly regarded speaker and invited panelist on topics including virtualization, ITSM, ITIL, configuration management, cloud secure architecture design, operational security, and compliance. George is also the co-author of CIS Quick Start Cloud Infrastructure Benchmark v1.00. George is also a faculty member for IANS. With that, I'm pleased to pass it over to George. You have the floor.
Hey, thank you so much, Kayla, and I appreciate that warm, long introduction. You did great. I really appreciate that. But I'm excited. Welcome everyone. This is a very hot topic today. Being the Vice President of Security Compliance at Sumo Logic, a company that's born in the cloud, native to the cloud, this is something that we've always lived and breathed, which has been DevSecOps before it became a big buzzword. So, we're here today just to share with you, how we run things on the back end today, how we move in an agile fashion along with our developers and our high production rate back to our customers without being disruptive, without being a roadblock within security. So again, welcome. I'm excited, and let's get started. So the agenda will just kind of go through, security as a code, what that really means, as we're starting to come into this continuous process of DevSecOps. We'll go through the meaning of where it came from, why it's important, and then, the meat of our presentation will really be around the 6 steps, the best practices you can take to improve your security DNA within your company today. Things that, we constantly improve on, but this is what we have narrowed down that really works in our organization and should have some takeaways that should work in your organization as well too. Then we'll go through a demo. So we'll take a look at a demo of threat investigations within AWS. So this is how we actually investigate threats. It's a live scenario leveraging Slack and Jira, VPC flow logs from AWS, and of course Sumo Logic on the back end. Things can get quite difficult when you move from UI to UI, so you want to automate threat response and threat incidents as much as possible. And then just go over some key takeaways and take some questions at the end. So just starting off, it's important to know our infrastructure and what that looks like. So again, born in the cloud, 100% in AWS 7 years ago. I've had the pleasure of being in charge of security with the platform for about 3 years now. I'm a veteran at Sumo Logic. And just some of the subtle differences when we say cloud. So when we're talking about cloud, we're talking about a full multi-tenant infrastructure spread across 5 AWS zones, soon to be 7 by the end of 2018. Some major advantages when it comes to security in a multi-tenant environment. One scenario of that is any kind of offering or patching that I do is patched across every single system, across every single tenant, very much unlike the single tenant type solutions that you see on your left. So the way that I like to look at single tenant solutions is they're very much like on-prem. I still have to provision for what I think I'm going to do. So if I think I may need 10 terabytes of data moving forward, I'm going to provision for 20 terabytes of data just in hopes that I will not reach capacity. There's no elasticity with single tenant solutions. And then ultimately, things like threat intelligence, so we leverage threat intelligence quite a bit on our back end to keep our environment secure. One customer gets it, all customers get it. So a lot of advantages to the elasticity of a multi-tenant type environment, the way we do encryption, which we'll get into later on, but very much a zero trust model, which I'll also demonstrate as well too. So having that capability to exist in a multi-tenant environment is a major security advantage for Sumo Logic. Okay, so what's driving the movement? The biggest thing driving the movement is speed. As a very famous Will Ferrell character said, if you're not first, you're last. And so right now there's a competitive disruption taking place all over the world. I mean, in every market you look at, there's disruption taking place. And what that means is that people need to deliver services and ease of use to their customers faster than ever before. Just kind of going back through time, just look at how Netflix disrupted Blockbuster, then Redbox disrupted Netflix, and then Netflix came back and disrupted Redbox by streaming services, and then had downloadable content, and now Amazon's disrupting Redbox. So it's all over the place. I mean, look what's taking place in the news today with Bitcoining. So now that Bitcoins are on the stock exchange, it's disrupting financial services. So there's disruption taking place everywhere. So development is moving at a very, very fast pace. And so security often gets left out of the picture because they're viewed as people who slow down the process, people who are naysayers, roadblocks. And oftentimes it can be true, because of the deep checks that we have to do, the non-automated functions that we have, the lack of visibility. And so what's happening now is security is getting or needs to get baked into this agile process. When you look at modern day applications and the idea of microservices and APIs and how they're being assembled, it's very different than a three-tiered app, and also not to mention the fact that a lot of these three-tiered apps were constructed in a traditional data center with a hard shell, soft center, perimeter security type approach. And now we're releasing things out into a hostile environment from day one, leveraging cloud. So when you look at cloud adoption, development life cycles mixed with operations, very key and moving very, very quickly. But now what we're starting to do is we're bringing in security processes and checks throughout that life cycle right from the beginning, so then that way it's not circumvented. And this is something that's a real problem out there today. So today we're going to discuss different options and different methodologies on how to make security collaboration work. I mean, it really is everyone's responsibility within the organization. You have to have constant awareness and training, but then just bake that into the DNA of your company. And that's the most important takeaway of what we're going to look at today. So what is DevSecOps? Well, DevSecOps is automating security within the DevOps workflow. So if you take a look at the way that DevOps works, there's a planning stage, which I highly recommend for every organization to get security people involved here. So start looking at getting away from traditional process type meetings like, change advisory boards or change control boards, and start fitting yourself more into the CI/CD pipeline. The more that you can be in a continuous improvement, continuous delivery pipeline, especially at the planning stage, the more you'll understand where your organization's heading, the tools that development's using, and how you can bake your processes in right from the beginning. So even when it comes to things like containers, I always tell people this, there's a container stack, and, yes, you secure the infrastructure with patching and namespaces and everything else, but, from the beginning, you got to understand where's Kubernetes calling out to fill its registry? Is it a local registry, or is it going out to like Docker Hub? And if it's going to Docker Hub, are they verified and signed? So anyway, there's many, many scenarios, but at the planning stage is just massive to be there. And one of the things that we do at Sumo Logic is we participate in scrums. So when you start moving away from waterfall methodologies and get more into agile development, you have smaller development teams that meet, and each developer talks about what they did yesterday, what they plan on doing today, and where things are slowing down or failing for them. And it's communication. It's getting things out in the open so you can track and manage and see where people need help. The same thing with security. Now, if I know that my shop is moving towards Kubernetes or Docker or any kind of other containers, and they're moving their workloads out to AWS, let's say, for example, then I can start putting my processes in place and to where it doesn't become disruptive or it doesn't become something that's bolted on at the end. Same thing when developers are coding. When developers are coding and it's an agile methodology, they should be releasing code in small chunks. So small deliverable chunks that are easier to manage, easier to troubleshoot, easier to check for security vulnerabilities. As they're being built out now and tested, I can also have my team start measuring everything throughout that portion of the stack in an automated fashion to make sure that when we move from a staging environment to another test environment, that code looks exactly the same, that there were no subtle changes. And even once we release and deploy it into a production environment, I got to make sure that consistency is there. So it's not just about checking up front or checking in the middle during the build and test. It's all the way through the entire life cycle, all the way till deployment, and then it never stops. It's continuous monitoring even once we're in that operational phase, because I still got to be able to log what's taking place within the environment. And obviously, we have a competitive advantage here because we come from a logging analytics platform, so we're constantly logging what's taking place. We're doing event monitoring to make sure that there are no new vulnerabilities being exposed. We're doing patching, across the environment within 24 hours, seeing what users with privilege management may be doing within the environment. And then finally, making sure that we're constantly trying to better our code when it comes to vulnerabilities. So to me, it always starts with developers. Developers are the ones that are driving innovation within the environment. Developers are the ones that have the keys of the kingdom and are able to make changes en masse. We talk about automation, but you got to be automating the right things, because if you don't automate the right things, you're going to have disaster at scale. So all this automation really starts with engineering. So encouraging that good security hygiene within your development types is the place to start. And you also have to get them, prepared to be able to do continuous assessments of their environment and compliance checks while they're building this code. So then that way you have evidence gathering all done in one location. And then ultimately as well too, you want to make sure that you have real-time threat alerting across all of your apps and services as this complex modern build starts taking place, again, with microservices and APIs out there. And then you got to be able to enable your developers to drive iterative security changes across the organization. So, at Sumo Logic, when there's a security vulnerability that's identified, our SLA is to get it patched within 24 hours. No ifs, ands, or buts. And I'll talk quite a bit about our change management process, but that's the SLA. There is no waiting a month. There is no waiting for, a vendor to release a patch and then going through this long process of getting it out there. Any potential security iterative has to be out there once it's found to be a true security patch and released within 24 hours. So let's look at these 6 steps. So these 6 steps, and again, we're constantly looking for ways to improve. This could be 7 steps, in 2018. It might be 5, but it started off really with 3, and then we've grown it out to 6 as we've grown as an organization. And again, you can take away maybe 1 or 2 of these for your organization when you're looking at how do I get started with DevSecOps. But these 6 steps are fundamental to our core on how we use the process to bake security into the DNA of the company. And it all starts off, with us with code analysis, just making sure that, build coding analysis into our continuous development chain, like I mentioned before, the CI/CD pipeline, and then with change management to be able to empower our teams to recommend and implement changes across the board, leading to compliance monitoring to enforce operational security, hygiene, and processes. And that's a big one, like I said before. We got to get away from those monolithic processes. And then threat investigation to be able to discover and investigate and remediate threats across all services, and leading to vulnerability checks, where you constantly have to have improvement, scanning, code and penetration testing for the environment, and making sure you have remediation and an automated threat response program. And then my favorite of them all, security training, and especially security training with developers, and making sure they have industry knowledge and get excited about putting security into their best practices. So let's break these down one by one. So when we get into code analysis, I like to call this a security pipeline. So you always hear about the CI/CD pipeline, again, continuous improvement, continuous delivery. Well, the security pipeline has got to mesh with that. And so one of the things that we do is we release code in very, very small consumable chunks in frequent batches. So our goal is 8 to 10 releases a day. And when you look at that, it gives you a real opportunity, because when you're looking at code in small bunches like that, it's easier to find vulnerabilities. It's easier to be able to automate checks for vulnerabilities with third-party tools, or even internally with your own scans. So that's a great place to start, is with that code analysis and taking a look right from the beginning all the way back into Q&A, like I mentioned before. So it all starts and ends there. If you can start getting a wrap around your code as far as potential vulnerabilities, and then things like not having passwords embedded into the code, all the things that we always dealt with before, and then we're not coming in afterwards and being disruptive. So it's a very, 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 very good place to start for almost any organization. So again, like I mentioned before in a previous slide, start getting yourself involved in a CI/CD pipeline, create your security pipeline, become part of the SDLC instead of focusing more on the CAB. Now the next step to this, well, change management. And this is one where I'll slow down for a minute because I believe that here is where we get exposed the most. I think that this is what slows down most traditional organizations today. And I know what a lot of people might be thinking. They might be like, wow, well, this guy comes from a cloud-first company. By the way, we're very highly regulated, which I'll get into in a second. But, when you stop and think about that and you're a traditional company, how do I make this move? Well, this is one of the first places you can become more efficient. As you start adopting a CI/CD pipeline, as you're moving workloads into the cloud, make that your greenfield opportunity with new processes as well, too. So for legacy stuff, it's going to be extremely difficult to bring that over. But as you're starting that process, get it into place where you start thinking more streamlining these archaic things, and then that way, as these workloads start moving over into these greenfield cloud-based opportunities, you can leverage them. So the way that change management's always worked in the past has been, you get together with your team, you decide what changes you're going to make, you take them to a change advisory board or change control board, you discuss what those changes are, a few people review those changes, they look at old Visio diagrams, they try to understand what the impact may be, and then, a week later or a few nights later or 2 weeks later, depending on if it's a major standard, a minor change, you roll out the change. And by the way, it's very, very inefficient because it doesn't account for extra change. So if I'm an administrator or a developer and I make a change out of band without a ticket, who knows? There's no way of knowing. In most organizations, they don't have that automated. It's also just slow. If you look at patch management the way it's done today, a vendor releases a patch and then, you have a month to be able to get all those patches out there. Your goal is to patch all those systems and not even account for any new vulnerabilities or any outages you may have. So the whole thing's broken. So at Sumo Logic, the way that we do things is we leverage two tools. So we leverage Slack and Jira. And so we have a Slack bot, which, I put a link here on this slide to, that constantly looks out for these changes. It automatically populates a Jira ticket with a proposed change. 3 out of 5 people have to approve that change, and then it gets executed within 24 hours. So very, very, very streamlined, very fast. It's the new way of doing things. And by the way, that Slack bot gets archived, and then that Jira ticket gets populated, closed, and we have a post-mortem on what took place, just in case we need to revive it later on. But it's all audited and accountable. Very, very streamlined. And it actually did what change management was supposed to do, which is absorb a higher rate of change with less impact to the business, less downtime. So very efficient to be able to streamline the process. Which now takes me to another bucket. So I mentioned highly regulated before, so Sumo Logic, we're on our 4th year of ISO 27001, first company ever to get CSA star, SaaS-based company. We're going through our 4th round of PCI currently. We're in the middle of that audit. All in AWS again, so all in cloud computing. We're HIPAA attestated, SOC 2, Type 2, EU Privacy Shield, so we have to demonstrate data sovereignty. We're going through GDPR right now, so we have a DPO or data privacy officer on staff, strong privacy program. I'll go through our architecture here in a minute, but everything's highly encrypted. So we're prepared for GDPR. We know what's coming on May 25th of 2018, and we're in very, very good position to be able to handle our customers' PII. But the important point here is as you're making these changes and as the code gets developed is to do compliance evidence gathering right now, right at that point, so then that way you don't have to backtrack later on and try to dig up, this information and make audit a one-time event. It should be streamlined right into this process to where now you have that evidence right on hand. You can provide it to your auditors. You're accounting for it from day one as these changes are taking place. So really critical to be able to do that. And then it also, when you're constantly doing compliance monitoring, this idea of continuous compliance, you're monitoring systems for bad behaviors after you rolled out those changes into the environment. The next step is going to be threat investigation. So now you've analyzed the code, you've looked for vulnerabilities there, you've empowered all these changes that are rapidly taking place across the environment, streamlined that process, you're doing compliance monitoring to gather evidence. Did you introduce any new threats? across the environment because you've deployed these things into production. So was there a hole that was left open? How are you responding to those threats? How are you prioritizing them? How are you not becoming numb to alerts? So bringing this piece into it is also very key, because now you're working with development. You're starting to look for these threats proactively, leveraging some things like machine learning, which I'll demonstrate here in a while, to be able to get this piece down hardcore and very, very quickly. Now, I go to vulnerability checks, so because I've released this code, it's sitting out in the cloud, I'm conducting daily scans of all production builds, so running ASV scans on a continuous basis. And this is something that's different too. If you think about a regular on-premise traditional company, well, I came from finance and they wanted me to run scans at 2 o'clock in the morning because it wouldn't impact, traffic and cause latency. Well, I don't get any information at 2 o'clock in the morning. I want to run my scans at the height of production, to really see what's taking place. And so we do code reviews and scans, every day. And then penetration testing is also big. We've just stepped up our game with bug bounties to replace penetration tests, which I'll go through in our architecture. But you have to also establish those remediation SLAs that I talked about before, and ours is 24 hours. And then finally, empowering developers through security training. And this is one of my favorite things on the planet. Like, we'll send a couple of developers to DEF CON every year. We give them a PowerPoint slide on what to wear, where not to stay. Don't bring your mobile devices to DEF CON because you might end up on the wall of shame because someone's going to hack your material. Really critical to get the devs thinking that way. And then what happens is, once they go somewhere like DEF CON, they see people who have their technical acumen and skills working on nothing but hacking. And so they get excited about it, they get a little bit scared, you bring them back into your organization to do lunch and learns, and it starts spreading like wildfire throughout the organization. So this is a great way to start baking security into the DNA of your company, is by doing that kind of security training. Now, we do OS training and all that online as well too, before, and those things are effective and constant touch points. But having them feel and see it live is a whole different experience once you go to something like a DEF CON in Las Vegas. And so again, going back through these 6 steps, this creates great hygiene into the security DNA of your company. Take 1 or 2 of them, maybe focus a bit more on change management, maybe code analysis. But these are 6 steps that work very well for us to be able to automate these processes into our overall organization and make sure that we remain very efficient as a security team. So now let's take a look at the environment. So I mentioned before a no trust approach. So again, for those of you that are moving out to the cloud, this is a great place to start putting in a zero trust methodology. So just to give you a high level of how ours works. So again, we're spread across multiple zones, but everyone comes in through the Internet of Things, and they have to pass through elastic load balancers. And so those elastic load balancers now lead you to 4 different endpoints. One is for API, the other one is for user interface, receiver, which will be the one that we focus on today for encryption, and then finally an administrative endpoint as well too. Once you go through, those 4 endpoints, and then there's a few things you can do, but again, we're going to focus more on the receiver side. The important thing to recognize too is that inside of that circle or this pod, none of those hosts can connect to the internet directly. So everything has to go back through a bastion host. But let's talk a little bit about that receiver. So all of our customers, as they come in, they immediately get two keys, 2 encryption keys, one for raw data and one for metadata, and they get rotated every 24 hours. This is how we remain PCI compliant. Those keys are encrypted with key encryption key, or KEK. Then they're stored in a third-party proprietary vault. You see the S3 bucket right there. And below that, you see where we have KEK. And then those keys are encrypted once again with KEK, rotated every 24 hours. So every customer ends up with 730 unique keys on their key ring by the end of the year. And so we manage, 10 billion keys across the planet. But it makes it very, very highly secure when you're rotating those 24 keys, or those keys every 24 hours. The way that we do zero trust is people come in through a VPN. And so when they come in through the VPN, to be able to connect to a production host. For example, our operations personnel needs to be able to come into our production environment where they're using SSH keys with 0 passwords. And they're allowed to SSH to a bastion host called Box. Box is the bastion server that logs absolutely everything our operations personnel do. And from there, they can SSH to individual boxes if they need to, or they can use a set of command line tools that we developed. It's internal, called Deploy Shell, to manage the deployment at a macro level of upgrading packages of our software from one version to another. So this allows for no east-west lateral movement. We then reaper those services off. Same type of methodology is in play when our customer support personnel has to go in through our other bastion host, which is called Box. So a couple of different ways to be able to separate this piece out. The next piece here that I want to talk about a bit is everything is logged, like I mentioned before, back into drinking our own champagne, which is Sumo Logic. We're using 3 AWS services currently at the time. So we're using CloudTrail to identify who's making the changes and what those changes are. We're leveraging VPC flow logs to be able to understand port protocol, source destination IP. So look at this as NetFlow for AWS, packet size, packet reject. And then we've just introduced GuardDuty as well too, which has been very functional for us to be able to identify things like public-facing security groups, which, by the way, never happens in any environment, but it's critical to understand that. So we take a combination of GuardDuty and CrowdStrike threat intelligence and bring that into our environment. And by the way, so again, here's the other advantage of multi-tenancy. Once we started using threat intelligence by CrowdStrike, rolled it out to 20 customers. Now every single Sumo customer over 1,800 gets threat intelligence feeds from CrowdStrike with built-in dashboards and saved searches like we use for free. So again, the power of multi-tenancy. A couple other things that are different about cloud security. So you see no inline firewalls. You don't see any inline deep packet inspection, and that's because everything's encrypted. But what we do is, on the host level, is IP route tables, which pretty much lock down each port protocol to a user, each process to a user. So that's also part of that zero trust model. We also use host-based file integrity monitoring, or FIM. We happen to leverage OSEC at the time. We do host-based intrusion detection services as well too, leveraging Snort. And so doing everything at the host level gives you an extreme amount of visibility. Remember before when I was talking about change management, I want to look for unwarranted changes. So plan, do, check, act. I want to check and make sure that the changes that we said we would do are accounted for, but that no extra changes took place within the environment. And so being able to roll out host-based security solutions like that, again, another advantage of cloud, another advantage of a zero trust model. So very intensive to do that. All data stored in S3 and very, very secure there as well too. I mean, we encrypt everything. Everything in transit is TLS 1.2. We deprecated anything lower, and then everything is AES 256-bit encrypted as well too. So now, just to talk a little bit about the AWS services, I highlighted 3, which were CloudTrail, VPC flow logs, and GuardDuty. But again, out of the box, we offer apps for all the AWS services. We've been actually running GuardDuty for several months. Since we're native to AWS, we get to bring things when they're in alpha mode and test them out for our own security, and then build apps around them for our customers. So it's very interesting to have those use cases internally and then share them externally and build upon those moving forward. But just know that we have apps across the board for all the different native AWS integrations. So what I'm going to do now is slow things down a bit, but we're going to talk about a automated demo that we actually do internally to be able to go out and look for these threat feeds, leveraging CrowdStrike, all via Slack. So what we'll do, and this is what you're looking at right now, is a saved search that actually runs out there and looks for threat feeds via VPC flow logs for blacklisted IPs. Once we see a blacklisted IP within the organization, we then have a few options of what we can do. And again, we're leveraging CrowdStrike for this. The first thing that we do is we open up a Slack channel. So once that Slack channel is opened up, it automatically creates a JIRA ticket. And it says, look, we found a blacklisted IP. It came into the environment. let me open up the Jira ticket associated with this so that I can start auditing everything to resolution. From that Slack channel, I have the capability to look and see if, the email address or user has been pawned before. So you guys know that website pawn, to where now I can start seeing if that email has been compromised before, so we'll do an automated check there, or I can launch in context from Slack to pawn to make sure that it's working, or that it's a viable email address. After that, I go to ThreatCrowd, and I go to ThreatCrowd to be able to check the domain within the environment. All of this, by the way, is done via a webhook from Sumo Logic right into VPC Flow logs to be able to start managing this. So now I've gone to pawn to see if the email's been compromised. I've gone to ThreatCrowd to identify if any other further correlations, or noted patterns with that user access, and then I get a result back on the domain results and IP results. Then I'm also going to take a look and see, is there a bad actor family associated with this threat? And so a lot of times I'll get one back. In this case, the results would have been MJ Rat, which is a bad actor family that's associated with that blacklisted IP. And then after that, I want to see if there's a human associated with it. So I'll go do a LinkedIn check and see if that human is actually, if there's a real person behind it. And then the great thing about this is right from Slack, I have the capability to do 4 different actions. I can either close the ticket because life looks good, or I can send an email back to whoever the user is and see if I can get them to reset their password, or just validate the fact that they had a blacklisted IP and some things look funky. I can also block the IP from VPC Flow logs, so I can build a security group automatically to block that IP, which is really, really cool. Or I can do a password reset automatically from Slack or MFA, all using a Lambda function in the background. So lots of different actions I can take all directly from Slack. But again, at the core of this is Sumo Logic driving these queries and bringing all of these solutions together in one location. So to kind of wrap things up here a bit, so the big takeaways that we have are, not bolting security on, So one of the things when you come from a traditional data center always is that it's a server, right? It's got storage, compute, network, all in one location. It just acts like a big server, and we're always bolting on security solutions like a firewall or like, deep packet inspection like I mentioned before, and then, having to backtrack and try to secure apps, and it just breaks things, So we're expected to secure things but break things because we're bolting it on, so we have to bake it in from day one. And I get it. If you're in a traditional enterprise or you're moving out the cloud and you're in a hybrid mode, you want to be able to bake it in from day one, and cloud gives you that opportunity. Leveraging microservices and containers gives you that opportunity. One of the things I love about containers, by the way, is that when we went from physical to virtual, we brought over a lot of those same tendencies and dependencies that weren't necessarily good. Services running in that image, registry items in that image without really understanding what they were there for. We didn't question it. To where now, this is a forcing function when we build a container to actually take a look and see what is the slimmest container that we can run, reducing our surface layer of attack and making us more secure. So making security the DNA of your company is absolutely critical. The second bullet point is being able to streamline archaic processes to remain agile. So again, we talked about change management, this long monolithic process that we go to. Start taking a real look at that and trying to condense it across the environment and leverage new tools to where you still have the auditability, but you're not going through this long process that usually doesn't have a lot of value when it comes, to the end result. And then a zero trust cloud security model. If you're moving out to the cloud now, it is very easy if you plan up front how to be able to control east-west lateral movement, how to be able to keep developers from SSHing into multiple boxes at once, how to track, log, and monitor and account for any kind of change within the environment that's undesired or prevent those changes. And then finally, bringing in threat intelligence into the cloud. So being able to look for those threat feeds is completely key, and leveraging that across your new cloud services like VPC Flow logs, like GuardDuty, and then being able to get down to what the high-rated level of confidence threats are. So instead of spending a lot of time looking across the environment at all threats and just becoming numb to alerts, getting to the ones that are going to that could be real within the environment and focusing on those and coming up with an automated threat response system. So before I close, one of the things I do want to mention is that when we did the demo, we kind of stayed on one slide there. So we'll definitely pass over these slides so you can see how everything works through Slack or a screenshot. But it's really critical to be able to leverage those things as when you live the cloud computing. On our Bastion host, we're currently running Netscope, so a CASB solution for cloud-based DLP. And I think that that's going to become more and more critical, not only when it comes to software as a service, but infrastructure as a service, to be able to have DLP solutions sitting within your cloud environment to be able to detect and make sure that privacy is being adhered to. So with that, we will go ahead and open it up to questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, George. I know I've seen a couple questions come through the line already. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us now via the chat window, and we will get as many answered as we can. So first question for you, George. We have a couple questions like this where if for people who are in maybe a more mature organization or one that's a little bit more ingrained or has some more complex processes or applications, where do you think the best place for them to start in this journey is?
For me, it would probably start in code analysis because I believe that every organization today is going to have an incubated team working on digital transformation that's leveraging microservices and containers. And so if you can start there, it's a great place to start getting your methodology going, seeing what works, getting code released without vulnerabilities in it, and then you can start spreading that across the organization and then implementing something else, like change management maybe afterwards. Change management is the hardest one, so that's a great question, Kayla, whoever asked that, because that is like a behavior that's been ingrained in IT now for a good 10, 15, 20 years, depending on how far back you go. But the time has come. The time has come to where not only does our security best practices, but also our processes have to become much more agile to keep up with what's taking place from a productivity and development standpoint.
In that vein, it's ironic that you mentioned code analysis. We had another question that's asking, what do you recommend to use for code analysis?
Yeah, great question too as well. I mean, there's a plethora of vendors out there. You have people like White Hat and Veracode in the space, and then you can do things like IOActive for code reviews. We're currently opening up the kimono for several people. We had used IOActive in the past. Still a very good vendor, but a lot of times you have to kind of refresh yourself a bit too. So we're looking at Checkmarks currently today. That's probably going to be who I believe we're going to settle on in 2018, which brings me to another thing as well. When you start doing these things, it's good to step up your game. Like we don't just do regular penetration testing anymore. I mentioned bug bounties before. So now we're working with HackerOne, and they have like a one-time cost for penetration testing, which we're going to reoccur every quarter. And so what it does is you get like 5 out of the top 10 hackers in the world, and they just, they do deep hacking on your environment from a penetration testing perspective with escalated privileges. And those things just make you better. You're going to see the threats go up in AWS more than ever moving into 2018. Well, because more workloads have moved there. It's just kind of like how Microsoft and VMware used to own the data center, so they always had vulnerabilities. Well, the same thing's going to start happening with AWS. So besides understanding the shared responsibility model and preventing things like S3 data leakage, which we can talk about as well too, step up your game, and get things like Checkmarks or, White Hat or Veracode in place, and then, step up your penetration testing as well too, and demand this of your vendors, So you see what we do as a SaaS-based cloud vendor, demand this of the other people that you do business with as well too. See if they have things like bug bounties running to continuously make themselves better.
Great. Thanks for explaining that. Next question we had, can you explain a bit more about how containers play into the security piece here? I know you mentioned it at the end in your takeaways, but maybe just a bit more information on how that plays into the larger picture?
Yeah, it does, because, again, it's a forcing function to kind of get to reducing the surface layer of attack of security and getting your hygiene down right, So it's the whole stack, So if you can start looking at the host level for things like namespaces and making sure that users with privileged access can't see what's happening with ordinary users. Starting to look at things like secure computing and making sure your filters are set correctly, and then making sure that patching is being done right. But here's what I really like about them that we haven't talked about very much, which is the idea of immutable images. So even though we patch things every 24 hours, we use Ubuntu across our entire environment. If I'm rolling out immutable images, that ceases patching. Because now all of a sudden, whenever I have a security patch I want to do, I roll out another image. So immutable images are definitely the now and the future of security. So if you haven't started diving into Kubernetes and Docker and taking a look at how that can help you out from a security perspective, take a look now. Because again, that'll be another place where you can communicate with your development brethren and start streamlining this whole DevSecOps mentality.
Great, thanks, George. Next question is, we got a couple along these lines. You mentioned GuardDuty and started diving into that, but maybe a bit more on how the pairing of AWS GuardDuty and Sumo Logic can help reduce threats.
Yeah, now GuardDuty is starting to give you, visibility from CloudTrail and VPC flow logs, and bringing that all into context as far as misconfigurations, potential threats across multiple VPCs, across multiple zones, but you still need to bring it all into one location, and Sumo Logic gives you that. So, again, drinking our own champagne, we look at this holistically across multiple VPCs, and then are able to not only identify threats, like I mentioned before, public-facing security groups, but here's a really cool thing you can do as well, too, from Sumo Logic is I can now launch in context from Sumo Logic directly to your AWS console, to our AWS console, and then fix the threat, or the misconfiguration. So developer has a public-facing, security group, 0.0.0.0/any. I can now launch from Sumo Logic right into my AWS console, assuming I have the credentials. I can come in and fix that security group. So a lot of value there to be able to streamline that process, a lot of visibility, big fans of GuardDuty combined with Sumo Logic. And again, that's an app that's available for free to our customers today, along with, like I mentioned before, the threat feeds from CrowdStrike, available for free to all of our customers out of the box.
Great, thanks, George. And I know that we're hoping to end at 1:45, so just one final question. Hopefully this one isn't too long. One of our listeners was hoping to understand a bit more about the threats that Sumo is seeing and what you as a security team are doing to try and reduce those threats and really be proactive there.
Yeah, it's funny. That question couldn't be more timely. I mean, it's really bug bounties, so we're seeing independent contractors, held up in quotes, hitting us up all the time saying, hey, we found a cross-scripting script, on this website, or, the service sumologic.com. It seems to be on a daily basis. And so what we've done, again, kind of talking about HackerOne before, is starting to step up that whole bug bounty program and penetration testing to reduce a lot of those inbound requests and get to the ones that are real. And that's really it when it comes to security, no matter whether you're on-prem or in the cloud. I do believe the cloud helps you is getting from, reducing the noise and understanding your signal-to-noise differential. You want to focus on the threats and vulnerabilities that are real and not waste time and effort. You don't want to become numb to alerts, because the day you do, and then you're going to get an alert that really matters, you're not going to pay attention. So, every year we take a look at our platform. We look and see what we need that's new. This year, moving forward, we're establishing some things like HashiCorp Vault for SSH management and API management. We brought in HackerOne and just ran our first bug bounty penetration test with them last quarter. Like I mentioned before, we're establishing DLP, so data loss prevention across our Bastion host. So every year it's a good idea to do that moving forward. But I'd say the biggest thing based off of that question, Kayla, is looking at our possible external vulnerabilities and getting down to the ones that are real by running a bug bounty program.
Great. Thanks so much, George. With that, we will conclude our webinar today. I'd like to thank George, our presenter, for walking us through these processes and his recommendations. I'd also like to thank all of you for joining us today and spending a little bit of time with us. If you have any additional questions, you can feel free to reach out to us at webinars@sumologic.com. Thank you again for joining us. You may now disconnect.